So we're on chapter 11 in your biology, and we're on section 3, and we're going to be talking about the endocrine system. The endocrine system, what does endocrine mean? Well, it means communicates by means of chemical rather than electrochemical impulses, nerve impulses. So it doesn't use the nerves, but it communicates by chemicals. And a lot of these chemicals are called hormones in your body. So the glands, let me go to the next one here while I describe this, and you see the different glands here, and as for hormones and glands. But the glands are the endocrine glands. They manufacture and secrete their products directly into the blood, and these are by hormones. And then we have the exocrine glands, and the exocrine glands manufacture and secrete products to the outside of the body, such as digestive glands and such as sweat glands. And endocrine produces hormones, and that's what we're going to talk about, a lot of different hormones. And these hormones are stimulators or messengers. They cannot change the body as quick as nerves do, but they're longer lasting many times. And they have certain receptors to these hormones. So a certain receptor may come in, basically the receptor receiving the hormones. These proteins called receptors bind specifically to one kind of hormone, like insulin binds to insulin, adrenaline to adrenaline, and these are called receptors of hormones. Now, hormones, there's many different hormones. Some are used to grow, some use to digest the food or have to do with food digesting or food breakdown, and others react to dangers, and others help other organs react. So hormones do a variety of things. So it's important that we know about all these different hormones, and we're going to go through each one of these and see which glands and what kind of hormones they're producing. So we're going to start with the pituitary gland. So let's look at where the pituitary gland is here in your brain. And this pituitary gland is called the master gland. The master gland because it does so many things. So let's remember, it's in your brain there. And so it's above the roof of your nasal cavity, and it's attached by a nerve stalk to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus up here, it's attached to the hypothalamus. So they work in congruency there together. So the hypothalamus, of course, is the part of the brain that connects this. And also hypothalamus works with the automatic nervous system too. So the pituitary lobe has an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. The anterior lobe is where the body's growth and development happens in the pituitary gland. And so let's talk about what the pituitary gland, what kind of hormones they produce. First of all, growth hormone is called somatotropin. Somatotropin is called the growth, is a growth hormone here in the pituitary gland. Let's go on the next, see if it shows up pictures. No, it doesn't. So I thought I had a picture here. So let's go back. Sorry. So anyway, the pituitary gland has, first of all, somatotropin, or somatotropin, I should say, how you say it, is the growth hormone, and it affects the skeleton system. And so if you have too much of it, you can be a giant person. So giantism is a person that's between 7 and 9 feet. Probably getting too much of this growth hormone in the posterior lobe. And also dwarfism is a midget if you don't get enough of this hormone of somatotropin. And so on to also another condition called acromegaly. It happens after childhood, where the head and the hands and the feet, you're producing too much growth hormone, and so you become unequal and a larger head, and so this is called acromegaly. So gonadotropin, what is gonadotropin? Gonads. Think of gonads. What are gonads? Gonads are basically sex organs, right? A gonad is your sex organ. A gonadotropin would be your reproduction growth. And then there's prolactin, and prolactin's for the mammary glands of mothers to produce mother's milk. And on to TSH is your thyroid gland. So it produces all these things. It's working with other glands. The thyroid gland, ACTH is the adrenal gland. ADH is the antidiuretic hormone that we talked about with the kidney hormone to conserve water. And it produces oxytocin, which has to do with the uterus, contracting of the uterus and oxytocin. So, in fact, they give women oxytocin sometimes to make their uterus contract for them to go into labor. So we have all these things. So the growth hormones, somatotropin and the gonadotropin for the reproduction, prolactin, TSH for the thyroid, T meaning thyroid gland, ACTH for adrenal, A meaning adrenal, ADH for antidiuretic in the kidneys, and oxytocin. All these things are in the pituitary gland. And then as we go on here, we're talking about the hormones and the pituitary gland. We're going to go into the next gland here. And so let's talk about the thyroid gland right here. So this is where your thyroid gland is. It regulates your metabolism, where your food is changed into energy. So if you have a lot of your thyroid gland is working overtime, you're going to have a high metabolism. Well, it's located there in your neck, below the larynx, right here. Thyroid and parathyroid glands are there. And so, it's basically has those twin, you can see how thyroid and parathyroid glands can work together because they're right next to each other. Well, the thyroid has twin lobes, and it regulates the rate of chemical activity in our blood cells by a chemical hormone called thyroxine. So thyroxine is produced there, and this thyroxine increases our metabolism and oxidation process of how our oxygen is brought in. It affects the heart and the blood vessels. The rate of the food is changed to energy. It goes quicker and regulates calcium in the blood. Calcium in the blood is regulated by the thyroid and the parathyroid together. Regulates calcium in your blood. And it's very important because calcium can be needed in your nervous system. It's important in nerves too, so calcium is very important. So basically thyroxine increases the calcium by putting forth a hormone, calcitonin. And then the parathyroid gland does the opposite. So it stores this calcium by the calcitonin in the bones, and then it gives up this calcium. So they these two regulate each other too, in the amount, especially in calcium. So here we go. We have this, and another gland we're going to talk about is the pineal gland, and that has to do with sleep. And we're going to talk about the adrenal glands that are on your kidneys there, and the adrenal glands and epinephrine, basically with the sympathetic nervous system, and so the fight or flight with the adrenal glands. And then we're going to talk about a little bit about the pancreas and the islets of Langerhans, and that's where insulin is produced, and insulin regulates our blood sugar. And of course, then we have hormones that are our sex hormones. Ovaries in the women are those organs that produce hormones there, and testicles or testes in the men, right? So you got that there? So if you look at this figure, you can see all these glands that are important in the endocrine system. We're going to talk about the reproduction in the next chapter, so we'll talk about that here. So let's see here. I'm going to see if we didn't have there. We're going to talk about the pineal gland going on here. So I'm just going to turn to here. So we talked about the pituitary gland and the thyroid gland here, and the parathyroid gland. So let's go down to the different, let's go through this really quick because I think it's kind of important. Because we have the pituitary gland with the somatotropin, the growth hormone, stimulates the growth of the bones. The gonadotropin stimulate the hormone that produced by the gonads, right here, which are their sex organs. Prolactin from milk, for baby's milk. And then on to the thyroid stimulant hormone, produces production of hormones by the thyroid gland. The adrenocorticotropin hormone stimulates production of some of the hormones by the adrenal glands. Antidiuretic by the kidneys, we know that, we studied that. Oxytocin stimulates mammary glands. And so we go on to the thyroid gland, regulates metabolism here, decreases the blood calcium in the parathyroid. Then we have the islets of Langerhans and insulin. It decreases the blood sugar. Insulin decreases the blood sugar by stimulating body cells to absorb glucose, and then glucagon. So this is very important. That's in the islets of Langerhans. And on to the adrenal glands, produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, prepare the body as a whole for emergencies, increase the heart rate, fight or flight, remember, breathing rates, such, and high alert status. And cortisol. Cortisol stimulates the body to repair and reduce swelling. Aldosterone regulates sodium and potassium. So all these things with adrenal glands. The pineal gland, melatonin. You know, if you can't sleep, you take some melatonin, right? Anyway, it triggers sleepiness and functions that are antioxidant too, which is good for you. And then we have the testes in men producing testosterone, and that stimulates the development of male secondary sex characteristics and produces sperm and such there. And then the ovaries, estrogen and progesterone are in the ovaries that help develop the feminine sex characteristics and perform various functions during pregnancy. Both of those do. So how important these are. So let's talk a little bit. I didn't really talk much about, let me go back to that picture, because I don't want to, talking about, I didn't really talk much about the pineal gland and stuff, but let's go back. So I'll show you where they are again. So let's talk about, we talked about the thyroid. Let's talk a little bit more about the thyroid there. So thyroid produces the thyroxine, which increases the metabolism in the parathyroid. Well, there's certain conditions. Let's talk about the conditions. What happens if the thyroid gland gets out of whack? You can have cretinism, which is a deficiency in thyroxine, and this causes a person to have an enlarged head, kind of slow and mentally slow, short limbs, and it's called cretinism. There's also hypothyroidism, and that's where you have a decrease in your heart rate, and sometimes your heart can enlarge because your heart rate's decreased. You also have myxedema, which you gain a lot of weight if you have hypothyroidism, and you may become weak, and you have thick skin and baggy eyes. This is all with hypothyroidism if you have thyroxine is low. And now there's hyperthyroidism, and that's an overactive gland, and people with hyperthyroidism are very weak and they gain weight. They can have thick skin too, or actually, no, they don't have thick. They're overactive and they're thin and they're restless and nervous and shaky hands. Kind of got really mixed up there between hyperthyroidism is overactive gland. So everything, your heart beats too fast, is overreacting. Your eyes are bulging out and you lose weight. That's hyperthyroidism. Going on to goiter. Have you ever seen anybody with a goiter and they have this big lump in the middle of their Adam's apple and it gets bigger and bigger? And this usually is the lack of iodine, but sometimes you just have to have the goiter removed because there's so much the supplements don't use in the swelling of your neck. So goiter has to do with the production of the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is not producing just what they need, the thyroxine and stuff, with the goiter. And then, of course, let's go down to the pancreas. I'm kind of rushing through this. So pancreas, islets of Langerhans there inside the pancreas. And again, we went over this a little bit before, but the pancreas is also a big organ for digestive and endocrine both. You know, we went over the digestive system, and a lot of pancreatic hormones are and enzymes are ingested into the small intestine. The islets of Langerhans, though, produce the insulin, and the insulin signals the liver and the muscles to remove glucose and store it as glycogen. So when you have insulin, it removes the blood sugar, makes your blood sugar get lower. And then glucagon is opposite. Glucagon increases the glucose in the blood, just the opposite. So glucagon can produce hypoglycemia, which if you have hypoglycemia, you probably need to eat more meals, small meals. And then insulin produces diabetes. Now let's talk a little bit about diabetes really quick. You can do a whole lesson on diabetes, so I can't, but basically diabetes mellitus is increase in blood sugar because your insulin is out of whack in some way. Diabetes means siphon, because people with had diabetes would have excess urine, and it seems they would be siphoning the water out, and that's how they knew. There's two different types of diabetes. There's type 1 diabetics. That's the type that they do not produce adequate insulin, maybe even when they were born with type 1 diabetes, and so they have to take insulin. And then there's type 2, and that's someone that the body is not really responding to the insulin right. And so usually people with type 2 are obese. They might have problem with obesity and not eating a good diet, and they're not exercising. A lot of times type 2 diabetics can be regulated with diet and exercise more than type 1, of course. So let's go on. That's the islets of Langerhans. Let's go on to the adrenal glands here. Those adrenal glands. The disorders of adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are on top of the kidneys, and they produce epinephrine. And epinephrine may be called adrenaline. Either way, you can call it adrenaline or epinephrine. And it is an energy action hormone. When it's like that fight or flight hormone. And when your emotions get out of whack and your heart rate gets up and your liver needs extra sugar, this all happens with epinephrine. And in fact, epinephrine, if somebody's heart stopped, and say you're in surgery and you're having heart surgery, or your heart starts, a lot of times they'll just inject epinephrine directly in the heart to get it going again, because it slams, like, it's like kind of like that epinephrine just gives that extra energy or into your heart to start it again. So that's kind of crazy, but they do that with a needle too. Anyway, going on, the outer shell of the adrenal gland has like 30 hormones. That's a lot of hormones in that outer shell of the adrenal gland. 30 different hormones. Whew. So, and a lot of these hormones are called steroids. So have you ever heard the word steroid? Well, steroids mean lipid. They're made of lipids or fatty particles. And one of the main steroids that helps repair injuries and such is cortisol. So cortisol, a decrease in cortisol, can cause certain kind of diseases like Addison's disease, where the skin turns brown and muscles are weak, and it's because they don't have enough cortisol. Their cortisol is down. And let's see, also aldosterone is tells the kidneys to conserve the sodium and secrete potassium. So basically the adrenal glands have to do also with our conservation of sodium and potassium, which are electrolytes in our body. So that's pretty important. And so there has to have that balance to conserve our water and prevent excess urine with the adrenal glands. So they're pretty important. So all of these glands are important. So we have these adrenal glands, we have islets of Langerhans. And we're going to talk about this part, our basically our reproduction system, in the next section. So, because we can get into all of that. Of course, they're called the gonads, and they reproduce the hormones and our reproductive hormones in our body. So, and going on to the, oh, I forgot one of them here too is pretty important. We didn't go over, I guess went over a little bit, was the pineal gland right here. And it's in our brain. So the pineal gland is in our brain, and it has, it's between the cerebral hemispheres in our brain. So it's kind of in the middle of our brain. And it basically regulates the body's waking and sleeping. And it's connected to this optic nerve. It's connected to the optic nerve in your eyes, so that you know with light and darkness and such like that, times of sleeping. And of course I talked about the melatonin slows the reticular formation, so that we could go, and the reticular formation in your brain basically is the main regulator of your sleep. And melatonin is the hormone. And so it'll wake you up and put you to sleep as the reticular formation. And melatonin causes you to be able to sleep. It actually measures nighttime. Reticular formation measures nighttime when it's those hours, you know, so you get so many hours of sleep. So a lot of these hormones are related to stress, and they're stimulated by the hypothalamus, the sympathetic and automatic nervous system too, and the adrenal glands, epinephrine, pituitary glands, the cortisol. All of these are so important, and when we have excessive stress, it can affect all of our hormones. So stress is kind of important. It actually can put strain on our heart and blood vessels, and give us ulcers and everything with stress in our body that have to do with producing our hormones in excess. So that's our endocrine system. So you can imagine this, all these hormones, these messengers going on our body. You can say, how could this just happen? God has definitely put details and made us fearfully and wonderfully made. And that's why we're going to go on to the next section, and we're going to talk about how we are fearfully and wonderfully made. So let's see that. Okay, the reproductive system. So we'll do that next time.